Sometimes the strongest walls we build around our hearts crumble with a single touch. Sometimes love finds us in the most unexpected places, when we least expect it and need it most. In a great Viking hall, warrior-chieftain Thrain Wolfborn claims his bride through duty, not desire. Linnéa, daughter of his enemy, stands trembling before this giant who could break her with one hand. Their marriage seals peace between warring clans. She expects cruelty from this feared warrior. He expects nothing but an arrangement. But when the hall empties and they stand alone, something changes. His rough hands touch her gently. Her frightened eyes meet his with unexpected courage. What happens when two people forced together discover they were meant to find each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient marriage cloak lay draped across the wooden chest in Thrain Wolfborn's chamber, its crimson fabric darkened with the blood of generations. Each thread told a story of unions forged not in love, but in necessity, alliances that had shaped the fate of the northern clans for centuries. Tonight, it would serve its purpose once more. Thrain stood before the tall window of his hall, watching the last light of day fade behind the mountains. At 32 winters, he had earned his reputation through countless battles, his name whispered. In equal parts, fear and respect across the fjords. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw spoke of a close encounter with death in the raids against the Saxon shores. His hands, calloused from years of wielding sword and axe, bore the marks of a warrior who had never known defeat. Yet tonight, those same hands trembled slightly as he fastened the bronze clasps of his ceremonial tunic. Marriage was a battlefield he had never entered, a territory where his skills with blade and strategy meant nothing. The woman who would soon become his wife was not a prize won through conquest, but a gesture of peace from a defeated clan, a living reminder of mercy where none had been expected. Linnéa of the Raven clan sat in the women's quarters, 3 floors. Below, her fingers working nervously through the silk of her wedding dress. The fabric was finer than anything she had ever worn, a gift from her new husband's household that felt foreign against her skin. At 19 winters, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that spoke of strength rather than fragility. High, cheekbones that caught the light, eyes the color of summer storms, and auburn hair that fell in waves past her shoulders. She had been the youngest daughter of Jarl Eriksson, a man whose pride had led his clan to ruin. When the Raven clan had challenged Thrain's authority over the trading routes through the northern passes, they had underestimated the Wolf clan's resolve. The war had lasted 2 brutal winters, ending only when Eriksson fell in single combat. Against Thrain himself, with her father dead and her brothers scattered to distant shores, Linnéa had become the key to preventing further bloodshed. The marriage proposal had come with the terms of surrender. Thrain Wolfborn would take Eriksson's daughter as his wife, and in return, the surviving members of the Raven clan would be granted protection and a place within his territory. It was a generous offer from a victor to the vanquished, one that had surprised everyone, including Linnéa herself. "You look beautiful, child," said Astrid, the elder woman who had served as Linnéa's companion during the journey to the Wolf clan's stronghold. Her weathered hands adjusted the silver circlet that adorned Linnéa's brow, a piece that had belonged to Thrain's mother. "Your father would be proud to see you bring honor to his memory through this union," Linnéa managed. A smile, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. She had heard the stories about Thrain Wolfborn, how he could cleave a man in 2 with a single stroke of his great sword, how his war cry could freeze the blood of his enemies, how he had never shown mercy to those who opposed him. Yet he had chosen to offer peace through marriage rather than complete the destruction of her clan. It was a contradiction she could not understand. The sound of horns echoed through the hall, announcing that the ceremony would soon begin. Astrid pressed a small wooden charm into Linnéa's palm, a raven carved from blackened oak, the symbol of her clan. "Remember who you are," the old woman whispered. "You carry the strength of your ancestors, and no man, no matter how powerful, can take that from you." As the heavy doors to the women's quarters opened, revealing the torch-lit corridor beyond, Linnéa took a deep breath and stepped forward into her new life. The marriage cloak awaited her in the great hall, along with the man who would become her husband. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the courage her father had taught her and the wisdom her mother had passed down. The great hall of the Wolf clan was a testament to their prosperity and power. Massive oak beams supported a vaulted ceiling, and tapestries depicting legendary battles adorned the stone walls. The central hearth blazed with a fire that cast dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled guests, warriors, jarls, and their families who had traveled from across the region to witness this historic union. Thrain stood near the altar, an imposing figure in his ceremonial armor. The bronze plates had been polished until they gleamed like molten metal, and his great sword hung at his side as a symbol of his authority. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples, was bound back with leather cords, and his ice-blue eyes remained fixed on the entrance where his bride would soon appear. Beside him stood his closest friend and battle brother, Magnus, Iron Hand, a man whose loyalty had been tested in countless conflicts. Magnus had questioned the wisdom of this marriage, arguing that showing mercy to defeated enemies might be seen as weakness by other clans. But Thrain had made his decision, and Magnus would stand by him as he always had. The ancient priest, Olaf the Wise, prepared the ceremonial cup that would seal the union. The vessel was carved from a single piece of walrus ivory and inlaid with silver runes that spoke of fertility, protection, and the binding of souls. Wine from the southern lands filled the cup, its deep red color matching the marriage cloak that lay across the altar. When the doors opened and Linnéa appeared, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. She moved with grace, despite her obvious nervousness, her chin held high and her steps measured. The silk dress flowed around her like water, and the silver circlet caught the firelight with each movement. Astrid walked beside her, a steadying presence in this sea of unfamiliar faces. As Linnéa approached the altar, Thrain found himself studying her face more closely than he had during their brief meeting 3 days earlier. He had expected to see fear, perhaps resentment in her storm-colored eyes. Instead, he saw determination and a quiet strength that reminded him of his own mother, who had ruled beside his father with wisdom and courage until the fever took her. During his 15th winter, the ceremony itself was ancient, its words worn smooth by countless repetitions over the generations. Olaf spoke of the bonds that unite not just two people, but two clans, two lineages, two futures. The marriage cloak was draped over both their shoulders, its weight somehow both comforting and sobering. When the time came to drink from the ceremonial cup, Thrain offered it to Linnéa first, a gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed by the watching crowd. Their lips touched the same rim, their eyes met over the carved ivory, and for a moment the great hall seemed to fade away. In that instant, Thrain saw not the daughter of his enemy, but a woman of remarkable composure, facing an uncertain future with courage. Linnéa, for her part, glimpsed something in his gaze that contradicted every story she had heard. A depth, a feeling carefully hidden beneath the warrior's mask. The feast that followed would be remembered for years to come. But as the night wore on and the guests grew merry with ale and song, both bride and groom found their thoughts turning toward what lay ahead. The marriage had been consummated in law and tradition, but the true test of their union would come in the quiet moments between them, away from the expectations and obligations of their respective clans. When the last toast had been raised, and the final song sung, Thrain and Linnéa found themselves alone in his chambers, the marriage cloak folded carefully and placed back in its chest. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, but inside, an unexpected peace settled over them both. The night held infinite possibilities, and for the first time since her father's death, Linnéa allowed herself to hope that perhaps this marriage of convenience might become something more, something real, something worth fighting for. The ivory wedding cup sat on the wooden table beside their bed, its carved runes catching the dying firelight. 3 days had passed since the ceremony, and Thrain had surprised himself, and undoubtedly Linnéa, with his restraint. He had not claimed his marital rights, had not demanded what tradition said was his. Instead, they had spoken quietly each evening, sharing stories of their childhoods, their lost family members, their hopes for the future of their joined clans. Linnéa had begun to relax in his presence, her initial terror softening into cautious curiosity. She discovered that the fearsome wolf of the north possessed a dry sense of humor and could speak of poetry as easily as warfare. He learned that the raven, Glan's youngest daughter, had inherited her father's strategic mind along with her mother's gentle heart. Their conversations had become the highlight of his days, something he looked forward to with an anticipation that both surprised and unsettled him. But on this 4th morning of their marriage, everything changed. The messenger arrived before dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and foam, his face grim with news that would shatter the fragile peace they had begun to build. Thrain was summoned from his bed by Magnus, who wore the expression of a man bearing terrible tidings. Linnéa stirred as her husband rose, pulling on his leather tunic with swift, practiced movements. "What is it?" she asked, sitting up in the bed they had shared chastely for 3 nights. The concern in her voice was genuine, and Thrain felt something twist in his chest at the realization that she cared about his well-being. "Trouble from the south," he said, buckling his sword belt around his waist. "I'll return soon." But the news the messenger brought would change everything between them. In the great hall, with Magnus and his other trusted advisors gathered around, Thrain learned that his decision to show mercy to the Raven clan had been seen as weakness by their neighbors. Jarl Gunnar the Red, leader of the Seawolf clan, had taken Thrain's gesture of peace as an opportunity to strike. 3 of our outlying settlements have been raided, the messenger reported, his voice hoarse from his hard ride. They came in longships under cover of darkness. They took livestock, grain stores, and— He paused, his face growing pale. "They took captives, my lord, women and children." The ivory cup in Thrain's memory seemed to mock him now. While he had been playing at tenderness with his new bride, real people under his protection had suffered. The weight of leadership pressed down on him like a physical force, and he felt the familiar coldness settle over his heart, the same detachment that had carried him through countless battles. "How many ships?" Magnus asked, his hand already moving to his weapon. 8 longships, perhaps more. Gunnar himself leads them. He's declared that the Wolf clan has grown soft, that you lack the strength to protect your territory. He's calling for other clans to join him in carving up your lands. Thrain's jaw clenched. Gunnar the Red had been testing his borders for years, looking for any sign of weakness. The marriage to Linnéa, meant to bring peace, had instead provided his enemies with the excuse they needed to act. His show of mercy was being painted as cowardice. His attempt at building something better twisted into evidence of his decline. "Gather. The War Council," Thrain commanded. "Send word to our allies. If Gunnar wants a war, he'll have one." As his advisors hurried to carry out his orders, Thrain found himself alone with Magnus. His oldest friend studied him with knowing eyes, seeing past the warrior's mask to the turmoil beneath. "This isn't your fault," Magnus said quietly. "Gunnar has been planning this for months. The marriage just gave him an excuse to move." "The people who were taken might disagree," Thrain replied, his voice cold as winter wind. "While I was playing the gentle husband, my enemies were preparing to strike at those I'm sworn to protect. And what will you tell your wife?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade. Thrain thought of Linnéa, probably still waiting in their chambers, wondering what had called him away so urgently. How could he explain that their marriage, the symbol of peace she had sacrificed herself to create, had instead become a catalyst for war? When he returned to his chambers, he found Linnéa dressed and standing by the window, watching the frantic activity in the courtyard below. Warriors were arming themselves, horses were being saddled, and the great war horns were being prepared. She turned as he entered, and he saw that she had already understood much from what she had observed. "You're going to war," she said. It wasn't a question. "Gunnar the Red has used our marriage as justification to attack our outlying settlements. He claims that showing mercy to your clan proves I've grown weak." Thrain's voice was harsh, stripped of the gentleness he had shown her over the past 3 days. "He's taken captives, women and children who trusted in my protection." Linnea's face went pale, and she sank into the chair beside the window. "This is my fault," she whispered. "If you hadn't married me, this is no one's fault but Gunnar's." Thrain cut her off, though his tone lacked conviction. He would have found another excuse eventually, but even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at him. Had he been wrong to pursue this path of peace? His father had ruled through strength and fear, never showing mercy to defeated enemies. Perhaps the old ways had been right. Perhaps kindness was a luxury he couldn't afford. The ivory wedding cup seemed to watch them from its place on the table, its carved runes now feeling like accusations rather than blessings. The marriage cloak lay folded in its chest, and Thrain wondered if it would be stained with fresh blood before this was over. "How long will you be gone?" Linnéa asked, her voice small. "I don't know." The honesty of his answer surprised them both. "Gunnar has 8 longships, perhaps more. He's chosen his moment well. Many of my allies are dealing with their own troubles. This won't be a simple raid to drive off. I could," she began, then stopped herself. "You could what?" "Nothing." It was foolish, but Thrain crossed the room and knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. The gesture was gentle, but she could feel the tension in his grip, the barely controlled anger that radiated from him like heat from a forge. "Tell me," he said. "I could write to the surviving members of my clan, those who scattered after my father's death. Some of them have found service with other jarls. If they knew I was asking, if they knew it would help protect the people who sheltered them, they might answer the call." Thrain stared at her for a long moment. The practical part of his mind recognized the value of her offer. Every sword would matter in the coming conflict. But the part of him that had begun to care for this woman recoiled at the idea of placing her in any danger, even indirectly. "Gunnar would see that as proof that you're plotting against him," he said finally. "It would put you at risk." "I'm already at risk," she replied with a quiet strength that reminded him why he had begun to admire her. "I'm the daughter of your defeated enemy, married to their conqueror. If you fall, what do you think will happen to me?" The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. In his determination to protect her, he had forgotten that her fate was now inextricably tied to his own. If he failed to stop Gunnar, if the Wolf clan fell, Linnéa would pay the price along with everyone else. "Write your letters," he said, rising to his feet, "but carefully. Use the old codes your father taught you, and if there's any sign that Gunnar suspects what you're doing, I'll stop," she promised. "I understand the risks." As Thrain prepared to leave for war, the ivory wedding cup caught his eye one final time. 3 days ago, it had represented hope, the possibility that peace could be stronger than violence, that mercy could triumph over vengeance. Now it seemed to mock him with its naivety, but when he looked at Linnéa, saw the determination in her storm-colored eyes, he felt something shift inside him. Perhaps the cup's message had been true, just not in the way he had expected. Perhaps the strength he would need for the coming battle wouldn't come from returning to his old ways of cold brutality, but from protecting what he had begun to build with this remarkable woman. The war that Gunnar the Red had started would test everything Thrain believed about leadership, about mercy, about the possibility of creating something better than the cycle of violence that had defined the northern clans for generations. But as he kissed his wife farewell, their first kiss, born of desperation rather than romance, he made a silent vow. He would return to her, and when he did, he would prove that their marriage had made him stronger, not weaker. That love, even in its earliest stages, could be the most powerful weapon of all. The warhorn's bronze surface gleamed dully in the pre-dawn light as Thrain lifted it to his lips for the final call to arms. The ancient instrument had summoned the Wolf Clan to battle for 7 generations, its deep voice carrying across the fjords to rally warriors who understood that their very survival hung in the balance. As the haunting note echoed off the mountain walls, Thrain felt the weight of his ancestors' expectations settling on his shoulders like armor. 200 men had answered the call, every warrior the clan could spare while still defending their main settlement. They stood in the courtyard below, their breath visible in the cold morning air, their weapons gleaming with fresh oil and sharpening. These were men who had followed him through countless battles, who trusted his judgment even when they didn't understand his decisions. Now he was asking them to risk everything because his attempt at peace had triggered a war. Magnus approached, leading Thrain's warhorse, a massive black stallion named Fenrir, who had carried him through a dozen campaigns. The scouts report that Gunnar's forces have taken position at Raven's Gorge, he said, his voice carefully neutral. He's using the captured villagers as shields, keeping them in the center of his camp. Thrain's hands tightened on the warhorn. Raven's Gorge, the very place where he had defeated Jarl Eriksson in single combat, where Linnéa's father had died with honor, if not wisdom. The symbolism was deliberate, Gunnar's way of mocking the mercy Thrain had shown to the defeated clan. Everything connected back to that choice, to the moment when he had decided to offer marriage instead of massacre. He wants me to attack recklessly, Thrain said, understanding his enemy's strategy. He knows I won't risk the captives' lives in a direct assault. He's betting that my newfound softness will give him the advantage. And what will you give him instead? Magnus asked. Before Thrain could answer, a commotion near the main gate drew their attention. A lone rider approached at full gallop, her auburn hair streaming behind her like a banner. Linnéa had left the safety of the stronghold and was racing to catch them before they departed. Several guards moved to intercept her, but Thrain raised his hand, signaling them to let her pass. She dismounted with practiced grace, her breathing quick from the hard ride. In her hands, she carried a leather satchel that bore the seal of the Raven clan, wax impressed with the image of a bird in flight, wings spread wide. "The letters," she said, offering him the satchel. "I've written to every scattered member of my clan I could remember. If even half of them respond, you shouldn't have ridden out here alone," Thrain interrupted, though his voice held more concern than anger. "The roads aren't safe." "Neither is my husband," she replied, meeting his gaze with steady determination. "Take the letters, use whatever advantage they might provide, and come back to me." The simplicity of her words, the quiet way she claimed him as hers, sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. In the space of 4 days, this woman had gone from trembling captive to partner in his struggles. She understood the stakes as clearly as he did, perhaps more clearly. "There's something else," she continued, her voice dropping to ensure only he could hear. "I've been thinking about Raven's Gorge, about why Gunnar chose that place. It's not just symbolic, it's strategic. There's a hunter's path that leads down from the eastern ridge, one my brothers used when we were children. It's treacherous, barely wide enough for a horse, but it comes out behind the main camp." Thrain studied her face, seeing not just the young woman he had married, but the daughter of a jarl who had learned strategy at her father's knee. "You're suggesting a flanking maneuver. I'm suggesting that Gunnar expects you to behave like the honorable warrior you are. He's counting on you approaching from the main pass, where he can see you coming, and use the captives to force a standoff. But if a small force could circle around, the risk would be enormous. Magnus interjected, having overheard despite their lowered voices. If they're spotted on that path, they'd be trapped with no way to retreat. But if they're not spotted, Linnéa continued, they could free the captives, while the main force creates a distraction from the front. Gunnar's attention would be divided. Thrain found himself nodding slowly. The plan had merit, but it would require precise timing and no small amount of luck. More importantly, it would require him to trust in the tactical knowledge of a woman, whose clan he had defeated, a leap of faith that went against every lesson his father had taught him about the nature of defeated enemies. I'll lead the flanking force myself, he decided. 20 men, the best climbers and most experienced in mountain warfare. Magnus, you'll take the main force and approach through the primary pass. When you see my signal, no, Linnéa said firmly. You can't lead the flanking force. Both men stared at her in surprise. It was Magnus who found his voice first. My lady, with respect, tactics are not... My husband is the symbol of the Wolf clan's strength, she interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that reminded them both of her royal bloodline. If Gunnar sees him approaching with the main force, he'll assume that's where the real threat lies. But if Thrain doesn't appear where expected, if the Wolf clan's leader is nowhere to be seen, Gunnar will suspect a trap and increase his vigilance. The logic was sound, and Thrain felt a mixture of admiration and frustration at her insight. She was right, of course. His presence with the main force would be crucial for the deception to work, but sending his best warriors on a dangerous mission, while he remained in relative safety, grated against every instinct he possessed. Who would you suggest lead the flanking force? He asked. Someone Gunnar wouldn't expect. Someone whose loyalty to you is beyond question, but whose tactical skill might be underestimated. Her eyes moved to Magnus, and Thrain saw his friend's expression shift from skepticism to understanding. She's right, Magnus said quietly. Gunnar knows I'm your shield brother, but he thinks of me as a simple warrior, not a strategist. He might not anticipate the move if it comes from me. The decision felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Thrain looked at the war horn in his hands, thinking of all the battles it had summoned his ancestors to fight. We'll try it, he said. Finally, Magnus, choose your men carefully. The path Linnéa described will test every skill they possess. As the final preparations were made, Thrain found himself alone with Linnéa for a few precious moments. The war horn hung at his side, and she reached out to touch its carved surface. My father would have attacked head-on, she said softly. His pride would never have allowed him to consider a more subtle approach. And perhaps that's why your strategy will succeed, Thrain replied. When this is over, he said, I want you to teach me more about the way you think. When this is over, she replied, I want you to teach me about the weight of command. The promise hung between them, a bridge across the divide that had separated their clans for generations. The silver raven pendant lay against Linnéa's throat. As she watched the two forces disappear into the morning mist, Thrain leading the main column toward Raven's Gorge, while Magnus and his selected warriors took the treacherous mountain path she had described. The pendant had been her mother's, passed down through 3 generations of Raven clan women, and she touched it now for comfort, as the weight of what she had set in motion settled upon her. She had sent her husband into battle with a strategy born from childhood memories and desperate hope. If she was wrong about the hunter's path, if it had become impassable in the years since she and her brothers had used it, Magnus and his men would be trapped on a narrow ledge with nowhere to retreat. If she was wrong about Gunnar's psychology, if he suspected the flanking maneuver despite her reasoning, the captives would pay the price for her miscalculation. You did the right thing, Astrid said, joining her on the observation platform above the main gate. The elder woman's presence was a comfort, a reminder that she was not entirely alone in this stronghold that still felt foreign despite 4 days of marriage. Your mother would have made the same choice. My mother never had to send men to their deaths based on memories of childhood games, Linnéa replied, her fingers still worrying the silver pendant. What if I've condemned them all? What if you've saved them? Astrid countered. Child, you cannot lead by fear of failure. Your husband learned that lesson long ago. It's why his men follow him into impossible odds. They trust his judgment, even when they cannot see the wisdom of his choices. Linnéa thought of Thrain's face as he had listened to her strategy, the way his initial skepticism had given way to consideration and then acceptance. No man she had ever known would have taken tactical advice from a woman, especially not one who had been his enemy mere days before. Yet he had not only listened but acted on her suggestions, placing the lives of his warriors in the hands of her uncertain knowledge. He's not what I expected, she admitted. The stories made him sound like a berserker, a man who knew only violence. But there's gentleness in him, thoughtfulness. He thinks before he acts, considers consequences that other warriors might ignore. And that troubles his enemies more than raw brutality ever could, Astrid observed. A man who can be both gentle and terrible, who chooses his moments of mercy and violence with equal care. Such a man is far more dangerous than one who knows only how to destroy. Below in the courtyard, the remaining warriors maintained their watch, but Linnéa could see the tension in their movements. These men had wanted to ride with their Jarl, to face the enemy with sword and axe, rather than waiting behind walls like women and children. Their exclusion from the battle was both practical, someone had to defend the stronghold, and symbolic. Thrain was demonstrating confidence in his plan by leaving capable defenders behind, rather than taking every available warrior. A horn sounded from the eastern watchtower, but not the deep voice of the war horn that had summoned the warriors to battle. This was a different call, higher and more urgent, signaling the approach of unknown riders. Linnéa felt her heart quicken as she turned toward the sound, shading her eyes against the morning sun to see what approached. 3 horsemen emerged from the tree line, riding hard toward the stronghold. Even at a distance, she could see they flew no banner, carried no identifying marks that would declare their allegiance. In times of war, such anonymity could mean anything from messengers, bringing vital intelligence to enemy scouts, testing the defenses. "Sound the alert!" called Bjorn Ironside. The grizzled Captain Thrain had left in charge of the stronghold's defense. Unknown riders approaching from the east. As the defensive preparations began, Linnéa found herself studying the approaching horsemen with growing recognition. Something about the way the lead rider sat his horse, the particular angle of his shoulders, stirred a memory she had thought lost forever. When the riders drew close enough for her to see their faces clearly, her breath caught in her throat. "Open the gates," she called down to the courtyard, her voice carrying the authority of her position as Thrain's wife. "I know these men." Bjorn looked up at her with uncertainty. "My lady, the Jarl's orders were to admit no one without proper identification." "The lead rider is Olaf Eriksson," she interrupted. "My brother." A stunned silence fell over the courtyard. Everyone knew that Jarl Eriksson's sons had scattered to the winds after their father's defeat, seeking service with distant clans or disappearing entirely into the wilderness. The return of any of them, especially here and now, could change everything. As the gates opened and the 3 riders entered the courtyard, Linnéa hurried down from the observation platform. She had not seen Olaf in over 2 years, not since he had left their father's hall in anger after a disagreement about the wisdom of challenging Thrain's authority. He looked older, weather-beaten from hard travel, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him their father's favorite advisor. "Sister," he said, dismounting with the fluid grace of a born horseman, "when I received your letter, I could hardly believe it. You're truly married to the wolf." "I am," she replied, lifting her chin with a pride that surprised her. "And he's not the monster our father believed him to be." Olaf's expression remained carefully neutral, but she could see him taking in every detail of the stronghold, noting the preparations for defense, the quality of the remaining warriors, the signs of prosperity that spoke to Thrain's success as a leader. The two men who had ridden with him were equally observant, and she recognized the type: displaced warriors, masterless men seeking a new lord to serve. "Your letter spoke of a threat from Gunnar the Red," Olaf said. "We came as quickly as we could, but if battle has already been joined—" "It's happening now," Linnéa confirmed. "Thrain has taken most of the warband to Raven's Gorge, where Gunnar is holding captives from the outlying settlements. I suggested a strategy that divides our forces, and if it fails, then we'll face the consequences together," Olaf interrupted. And for the first time since his arrival, his expression softened. "I may have disagreed with our father about many things, but I never stopped believing in the wisdom of his youngest daughter. If you think this marriage can bring good to our people, then I'll support it." The silver raven pendant seemed to grow, warm against her throat, as if her mother's spirit approved of this reunion. But even as she felt a surge of relief at her brother's presence, Linnéa knew that his arrival complicated an already dangerous situation. If the battle went badly, if Thrain fell and Gunnar's forces arrived at the stronghold, having the last son of Jarl Eriksson present would only give their enemies more reason to show no mercy. "There's something else," Olaf continued, lowering his voice. "Rumors have been spreading about your marriage, about Thrain's show of mercy. Some see it as weakness, others as wisdom. There are Jarls who might ally with him against Gunnar if they see proof that his new approach brings results. And if it doesn't, then those same Jarls will line up to divide his territory," Olaf admitted. "Everything depends on what happens at Raven's Gorge." "It won't fail," Linnéa said with more confidence than she felt. "It can't." The silver raven pendant caught the light as she moved, a reminder of her heritage and the weight of decisions that could reshape the fate of clans. The morning stretched on, each moment heavy with uncertainty, as they waited for word from Raven's Gorge. The carved bone whistle felt cold against Magnus's lips as he crouched behind the windswept rocks above. Raven's Gorge, watching Gunnar the Red's encampment spread out below like a map of his enemy's arrogance. The whistle was ancient, carved from the thigh bone of a great whale and etched with runes that promised swift passage for urgent messages. It had belonged to his grandfather, a ship captain who had used it to communicate across the chaos of sea, battles, and now Magnus would use it to coordinate the most dangerous gambit of his military career. The hunter's path that Linnéa had described in her childhood memories had proven real, though barely. For 3 treacherous hours, Magnus and his 19 chosen warriors had picked their way down the narrow trail, leading their horses single file along ledges that crumbled under their feet and across gaps that tested both courage and balance. 2 men had nearly fallen to their deaths when loose stone gave way beneath them, saved only by the quick reflexes of their companions and the ropes they had brought for just such emergencies. But they had made it. Now, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gorge, Magnus could see why Gunnar had chosen this place for his stand. The main approach from the north offered no cover, forcing any attacking force to advance across open ground under the eyes of defenders positioned on the high ground. The captives, nearly 60 women and children from the outlying settlements, were clustered in the center of the camp, their presence making any direct assault unthinkable. Gunnar himself was visible among his warriors, a tall figure in red-painted armor who moved with the confidence of a man certain of his tactical superiority. Magnus had fought against him twice before, in smaller skirmishes along the disputed borders, and knew him to be both cunning and ruthless. The Sea Wolf leader had positioned his 8 longship crews in overlapping defensive positions, creating kill zones that would devastate any conventional attack. The bone whistle would be Magnus's lifeline, the tool that would allow him to coordinate with Thrain's main force when the moment came to strike. One long blast would signal that the flanking force was in position. 2 short blasts would mean the rescue of the captives had begun. 3 sharp notes would indicate retreat if the plan went disastrously wrong. "There," whispered Sven Blackbeard. one of Magnus's most trusted warriors, pointing toward a cluster of makeshift shelters near the eastern edge of the camp. The captives are being held there, away from the main defensive positions, but still under guard. Magnus studied the arrangement through narrowed eyes. 6 warriors stood watch over the prisoners, rotating in pairs to maintain constant vigilance. Getting past them would require precise timing and absolute silence. Any alarm raised too early would doom both the captives and the rescue attempt. When Thrain's horn sounds from the main approach, those guards will look north, Magnus observed. That's our moment. Bjorn and Hal take the nearest sentries, Eric and Olaf the middle pair. Sven and I will handle the far guards. Remember, silent kills only. No battle cries, no clashing steel until we're ready to withdraw. The bone whistle caught the light as Magnus adjusted his position, its carved surface telling the story of his family's maritime heritage. His grandfather had used this same instrument to rally scattered ships during the Great Raid on the Frankish coast, bringing order to chaos through the simple power of coordinated communication. Now it would serve a more merciful purpose, helping to free the innocent rather than coordinate their capture. A faint sound drifted up from the valley below, the deep, resonant call of Thrain's war horn announcing the approach of the wolf clans. Main force, right on schedule. Magnus felt his heart rate quicken as he saw the effect on Gunnar's warriors. Every eye turned toward the northern approach. Every weapon shifted toward the expected threat. The psychological impact was exactly what they had hoped for. Gunnar's attention was fixed on the obvious danger, while the real threat crept closer from an unexpected direction. "Remember your training," Magnus whispered to his men. "We go down. Fast, free the captives, and get them to safety before Gunnar realizes what's happening. If we're discovered too early, we follow the plan." Sven interrupted quietly. "Trust in Thrain's assault to cover our withdrawal." The bone whistle felt warm now against Magnus's palm, heated by his grip and the nervous energy that coursed through his body. In the valley below, he could see Gunnar's forces beginning to arrange themselves for battle, confident in their superior position and the human shields that protected them from direct assault. The sea-wolf leader had no idea that his greatest tactical advantage was about to become his greatest vulnerability. Magnus raised the bone whistle to his lips and blew one long, clear note that echoed off the canyon walls. The sound was distinctive enough to reach Thrain's ears, but natural enough to blend with the wind and the calls of mountain birds. To Gunnar's warriors, it would seem like nothing more than the voice of the wilderness itself. The descent began. In earnest now, 20 warriors moving like shadows down the rocky slope toward the camp below. Each man carried only his most essential weapons, a long knife for silent work, a hand axe for close combat, and a length of rope for the inevitable. Retreat! Their mail shirts had been wrapped in cloth to prevent the telltale chinking of metal that might give them away, and their beards were bound tight to keep them from catching on thorns or rocks. The bone whistle hung from a leather cord around Magnus's neck, ready to sound the crucial signals that would coordinate the most complex rescue attempt the Wolf clan had ever undertaken. Everything depended on timing now, on reaching the captives before Gunnar's attention could shift from the northern threat to the danger creeping up behind him. As they moved through the scattered boulders and scrub brush that marked the outer edge of the camp, Magnus found himself thinking of Linnéa and the trust Thrain had placed in her strategic insight. A woman barely 19 winters old had conceived this plan, had seen possibilities that escaped veteran warriors, had provided the key to turning Gunnar's strongest position into a weakness. If they succeeded, it would validate not just her specific strategy, but the broader principle that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. The first guard post loomed ahead, 2 warriors in sea-wolf colors standing beside a crude watchtower made from ship's timber. They were looking north toward the sound of Thrain's approaching force, their attention completely focused on the expected battle. Magnus signaled to Bjorn and Hal, watching as his men moved into position with the fluid grace of predators stalking their prey. The bone whistle remained silent for now, waiting for the moment when its voice would unleash 20 warriors into the heart of enemy territory. Everything balanced on this instant. The lives of 60 captives, the reputation of the Wolf clan, the future of Thrain's marriage to the woman whose strategy had made this rescue possible. Magnus gripped his knife and prepared to test whether mercy could indeed prove stronger than brutality, whether trust placed in unexpected allies could triumph over the traditional certainties of Viking warfare. The iron war axe gleamed with fresh blood as Thrain stood at the head of his warband, watching Gunnar the Red's forces arrange themselves for battle across the killing ground of Raven's Gorge. The weapon had been his father's before him, its blade notched from 100 battles, but still sharp enough to cleave through mail and bone with a single stroke. Today, it would either carve a path to victory or mark the end of the Wolf clan's dominance in the northern territories. Behind him, 180 warriors waited in disciplined silence, their shields locked and their spears ready. They had approached openly along the main pass, making no attempt at stealth or surprise, deliberately drawing every eye in Gunnar's camp toward their obvious threat. It was the most difficult kind of military performance, appearing to be exactly what they seemed while concealing the true nature of their purpose. Thrain could see the captives in the distance, huddled together in the center of Gunnar's defensive. Positioned like sheep, surrounded by wolves, 60 innocent lives hung in the balance, their fate dependent on the success of a plan conceived by his 19-year-old bride and executed by warriors who were betting their lives on her childhood. Memories, the weight of command, had never felt heavier than it did in this moment, with so many variables beyond his direct control. "They're confident," observed Tormund Greyeye, Thrain's senior captain, studying the enemy's formations through the afternoon. Hayes, Gunnar's positioned his best crews on the flanks, leaving his newer recruits to guard the center. He's expecting us to try a direct assault on the captives. "Which is exactly what we want him to expect," Thrain replied, though his voice carried none of the certainty his words implied. In truth, he was fighting a battle on two fronts, against Gunnar's forces in the gorge below and against his own. Doubts about the wisdom of this strategy, every instinct trained into him by years of warfare, suggested that dividing his forces in the face of a prepared enemy was tantamount to suicide. But Linnéa's logic had been compelling. Gunnar's entire tactical position depended on using the captives as human shields, forcing any attacker to choose between accepting massive casualties or abandoning the rescue attempt entirely. A conventional assault would play directly into his hands, allowing him to inflict devastating losses while maintaining the moral high ground of protecting the innocent. Only an unconventional approach had any chance of success. The iron war axe felt heavier than usual in Thrain's grip, weighted down by the uncertainty that gnawed at his confidence. Had he been right to trust in his wife's strategic insight, or had he allowed his growing feelings for her to cloud his military judgment? The question would be answered soon enough, but the price of being wrong would be measured in the lives of his most trusted warriors. A sound drifted across the valley, the clear, penetrating call of a bone whistle, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakably the signal he had been waiting for. Magnus was in position. The flanking force had successfully navigated the treacherous hunter's path and was ready to begin the rescue attempt. Now everything depended on Thrain's ability to hold Gunnar's attention while his shield brother worked to free the captives. "Sound the advance," Thrain commanded, raising his axe above his head. "Make it look like we mean to charge their center." The Wolf clan's war horn responded with its deep primal call, a sound that had struck terror into the hearts of enemies. For 7 generations, Thrain's warriors began to move forward in perfect formation, their shields overlapping in the traditional skjaldborg that had proven its worth in countless battles. To Gunnar's watching forces, it would appear to be the beginning of a conventional assault, exactly the kind of frontal attack they were prepared to repel. But as they advanced, Thrain found his thoughts turning not to the battle ahead, but to the woman he had left behind in the safety of his stronghold. Linnéa had transformed from terrified captive to trusted advisor in the space of less than a week, showing him possibilities he had never considered and perspectives that challenged every assumption about leadership and warfare. The iron war axe in his hands represented the old ways, the traditional path of strength and dominance that had served his clan for generations. Yet here he was, implementing a strategy that relied on subtlety and misdirection rather than brute. "Of course, halt at 200 paces," he ordered, his voice carrying clearly over the measured tramp of booted feet. "Form the wall and make them think we're preparing for a charge." The Wolf Clan warriors obeyed with the precision of long practice, their shields coming together with a thunderous crash that echoed off the canyon walls. Spear points bristled between the gaps, creating a hedge of steel that spoke of disciplined violence held barely in check. It was a display designed to fix Gunnar's attention on the threat directly in front of him, while Magnus worked to undermine his position from behind. Across the valley, Thrain could see Gunnar himself, striding along. His battle line, his red-painted armor catching the afternoon sun like spilled blood. The sea-wolf leader was shouting encouragement to his warriors, clearly confident in his superior position and the human shields that protected his flanks. He had no idea that his greatest tactical advantage was about to become his greatest vulnerability. This iron war axe felt more familiar now in Thrain's grip, its weight a reminder of all the battles that had brought him to this moment. But for the first time in his career as a military leader, he found himself hoping that the weapon would remain unused, that victory could be achieved through strategy rather than slaughter. It was a strange feeling for a man who had built his reputation on the battlefield, yet it felt right in a way that surprised him. Another sound drifted across the gorge. 2 short blasts from Magnus's bone whistle, the signal that the rescue attempt had begun. Somewhere behind Gunnar's confident lines, 20 Wolf Clan warriors were moving through shadows and silence toward the captives, whose freedom would determine the outcome of this confrontation. Everything now depended on whether Linnéa's understanding of the terrain had been accurate, whether her assessment of enemy psychology had been correct. "They're stirring," Tormund observed, watching the sea-wolf forces through narrowed eyes. "Something's got their attention in the rear," Thrain felt, his heart quicken. If Magnus had been discovered too early, if the rescue attempt had failed before it could properly begin, then the entire strategy would collapse into disaster. His flanking force would be trapped in enemy territory, while his main force remained too far away to provide effective support. It would be exactly the kind of catastrophic failure that his enemies expected from a leader who had supposedly grown soft. But even as doubt gnawed at him, Thrain forced himself to maintain the facade of confidence that his warriors expected. The iron war axe remained steady in his grip, a symbol of strength that masked the uncertainty churning beneath the surface. Leadership, he was learning, sometimes meant betting everything on the wisdom of others, trusting in perspectives that challenged his own understanding of how the world worked. The afternoon sun continued its slow descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the valley where 2 armies faced each other in a contest that would reshape the balance of power among the northern clans. In the distance, the bone whistle remained silent, leaving Thrain to wonder whether that silence meant success or disaster for the men who had risked everything on his wife's strategic vision. The golden arm ring caught the dying sunlight as Magnus crouched over the body of the last guard, his knife still warm with blood that would never wash clean from his conscience. The ring had belonged to the dead man, a young warrior barely older than Magnus's own son, wearing the sea-wolf colors but bearing the craftsmanship of the eastern fjords. It was the kind of detail that would have been meaningless in the heat of battle. But in this moment of terrible clarity, it spoke of lives cut short and families that would never see their sons return home. The rescue had begun perfectly. 6 guards silenced in coordinated strikes, the captives freed from their bonds and gathered for evacuation. Magnus had blown the 2 short blasts on his bone whistle to signal success, and his warriors had begun leading the women and children toward the escape route up the hunter's path. Everything had unfolded exactly as Linnéa's strategy had predicted. Then the trap had revealed itself. "It's empty," Sven Blackbeard whispered from the crude shelter where they had expected to find the most valuable hostages. "The shelter's empty. These aren't the real captives." Magnus felt his blood turn to ice as the implications crashed over him like a cold wave. The people they had rescued, frightened, grateful, desperate to reach safety, were not the women and children from the outlying settlements. They were actors, volunteers from Gunnar's own clan, positioned to draw the rescue. Attempt into exactly this position. The real captives were hidden somewhere else entirely, and now Magnus and his warriors were trapped in the heart of enemy territory with their escape route compromised. The golden arm ring glinted accusingly in the fading light, a reminder that the blood on his hands had been spilled for nothing more than an elaborate deception. Gunnar the Red had anticipated their strategy, had turned Linnéa's clever plan against itself with a subtlety that matched her own. The sea-wolf leader had proven himself more cunning than any of them had imagined. Movement on the ridge. Eric hissed, pointing toward the eastern heights where their escape route lay. Dozens of warriors, moving to cut off our retreat. The bone whistle felt cold against Magnus's chest as he realized the full scope of their predicament. Gunnar had not only anticipated the flanking maneuver, but had prepared a counter-trap that would eliminate the Wolf clan's most experienced warriors in a single stroke. The real captives were probably hidden in the main camp, protected by the bulk of the Sea-Wolf forces, while the rescue attempt was lured into this killing ground. "Signal retreat?" Sven asked, his hand moving toward his weapon as the sound of approaching enemies grew louder from multiple directions. Magnus looked at the golden arm ring in his palm, thinking of the young warrior who had died wearing it, of the families on both sides who would mourn their losses when this day was done. 3 sharp blasts on the bone whistle would tell Thrain to abort the entire operation, to withdraw his main force before they too were drawn into whatever secondary trap Gunnar had prepared. It was the tactically sound decision, the choice that would preserve the Wolf clan's strength for future battles, but it would also abandon the real captives to whatever fate Gunnar had planned for them. "Where would you hide the real prisoners?" Magnus asked, his mind racing through the possibilities. "If you were Gunnar, knowing that someone might attempt a rescue, where would you keep them truly safe?" "The longships," Bjorn answered without hesitation. "Anchored in the deep water at the mouth of the gorge, too far out for swimmers to reach, but close enough to control. If the rescue fails, he can sail them away as insurance against retaliation." The golden arm ring seemed to grow, heavier in Magnus's palm as he considered their options. The longships were a quarter-mile downstream from their current position, accessible only by following the gorge floor directly through the heart of Gunnar's defensive positions. It would mean abandoning any hope of stealth, committing to open battle against superior numbers with no hope of reinforcement. 20 men against 8 ship crews, Sven observed grimly. "Even if we could reach the longships, we'd never survive the boarding action. Not if we attack them conventionally," Magnus agreed. "But what if we don't?" He was thinking of the golden arm ring, of the young warrior who had died wearing it, of the craftsmanship that spoke of distant fjords and foreign traditions. Gunnar's forces were not a unified clan, but a collection of warriors from different territories, bound together by the promise of plunder rather than blood loyalty. Such alliances were always fragile, always vulnerable to the right kind of pressure. "We don't attack the ships," Magnus said, his plan crystallizing as he spoke. "We attack their confidence. Gunnar's entire strategy depends on his allies believing he can deliver victory without unacceptable losses. But if we can make this rescue cost more than they bargained for..." The bone whistle touched his lips as he raised it to sound the retreat. Signal. But instead of 3 sharp blasts, he blew a different pattern entirely, one long note followed by 2 short ones, repeated 3 times. It was an improvised signal, one that would tell Thrain that the situation had changed dramatically, but that the operation was not yet lost. "What are you thinking?" Sven demanded. "I'm thinking that Gunnar made one mistake," Magnus replied, pocketing the golden arm ring. "He assumed we would retreat when we discovered his deception. He's positioned his forces to cut off our escape, not to defend against a desperate assault on his most valuable assets." The sound of pursuit was growing closer. Now, warriors moving through the gathering dusk to close the trap around them. But Magnus could also hear something else. The distant sound of conflict from the direction of the main pass, where Thrain's forces were presumably discovering their own unpleasant surprises. Gunnar had planned this carefully, timing multiple deceptions to unfold simultaneously. "The longships it is, then," Sven said, checking his weapons with the calm professionalism of a man who had accepted his likely death. "At least we'll die with purpose." "We're not planning to die," Magnus corrected. "We're planning to make Gunnar's victory cost more than his allies are willing to pay. Every warrior we kill, every ship we damage, every moment we force them to fight for what should have been an easy prize. It all undermines the confidence that holds his coalition together." The golden arm ring had belonged to a young man who had trusted in his leader's promises, who had believed that following Gunnar, the red would bring glory and wealth without unacceptable risk. Now that young man was dead, and his arm ring would serve a different purpose, a reminder that trust placed in the wrong leader could exact a terrible price. As Magnus and his warriors began their desperate charge toward the longships, the bone whistle bounced against his chest with each running step. Its voice had already sounded the signals that would reshape this battle, turning Gunnar's clever trap into an opportunity for a different kind of victory. Not the clean success they had hoped for, but perhaps something more valuable, a demonstration that the Wolf clan would never abandon their people, no matter the cost. The golden arm ring caught the last light of day as Magnus drew his sword, and prepared to test whether desperate courage could triumph over careful planning, whether loyalty to the innocent could overcome the calculations of clever enemies. Behind him, 19 warriors followed their leader into what might be their final battle, trusting in his judgment as he had trusted in Linnéa's strategy. The real test of leadership, Magnus was learning, came not when plans succeeded, but when they failed, when the only choice was between retreat and a desperate gamble that might save lives at the cost of your own. The obsidian knife lay across Thrain's palm like a shard of frozen midnight, its volcanic glass edge sharper than any, steel but brittle as the trust that had been shattered this day. The weapon had been a gift from his wife on their wedding night, not the ivory cup or bronze clasp that tradition demanded, but this ancient blade that had belonged to her grandmother, a woman renowned for her ability to see through deception and cut to the heart of any matter. Now, as Thrain crouched behind the boulder that sheltered him from Gunnar's archers, the knife seemed to mock him with its promise of clarity. The battle had gone disastrously wrong. Magnus's improvised signal from the bone whistle had warned him that the rescue attempt had failed, but it had taken precious minutes for Thrain to understand the full scope of Gunnar's deception. By then, his main force was committed to an assault against prepared positions, taking casualties while achieving nothing more than Gunnar's amusement. The Sea Wolf leader had anticipated every move, turned every strategy against itself with a sophistication that spoke of careful planning and intimate knowledge of Wolf clan tactics. "We're losing men for nothing," Tormund Greyeye reported, sliding behind the boulder with an arrow protruding from his shield. "Gunnar's got us exactly where he wants us, charging uphill against prepared positions, while our best warriors are trapped somewhere behind his lines." The obsidian knife caught what little light remained of the day, its surface reflecting the fires that had begun to spread through the dry grass where Gunnar's fire arrows had found their marks. The weapon was beautiful in its simplicity, a reminder that the most effective tools were often the most direct ones. But directness had failed them today. Gunnar had proven himself the superior strategist, using their own cleverness against them with devastating effectiveness. Pull back to defensive. Positions, Thrain ordered, though the words tasted like defeat in his mouth. Send runners to establish contact with Magnus if possible. We need to know his situation before we can plan our next move. But even as he gave the order, Thrain knew that their options were severely limited. Magnus and his 20 warriors were almost certainly dead or captured by now, victims of the same overconfidence that had led the Wolf clan into this trap. The real captives remained in enemy hands, probably aboard the longships where they could be spirited away if the battle turned against Gunnar, and his own forces were pinned down in an untenable position, taking losses without the possibility of meaningful retaliation. The obsidian knife seemed to grow warmer in his grip as he considered their predicament. Linnéa had given him this weapon as a symbol of her trust, a pledge that she would share not just her body, but her mind with the man she had married. The tight blade had been blessed by the wise women of her clan, imbued with the wisdom of generations who had learned to see through surface appearances to the truth beneath. Now, it would serve as a reminder of how catastrophically wrong he had been to trust in that wisdom. A commotion from the direction of the gorge drew his attention. Through the gathering dusk, he could see flames spreading along the waterline where the longships were moored. Magnus was still alive, still fighting, still causing problems for Gunnar, despite being outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The sight sent a surge of hope through Thrain's chest, followed immediately by the crushing realization that his shield brother's heroics would only delay the inevitable. "Something's happening at the ships," Tormund observed, squinting through the smoke that was beginning to drift across the battlefield. "Looks like Magnus found them after all, and probably got himself killed in the process," Thrain replied, though his voice carried more pride than grief. Magnus had always been the kind of warrior who would rather die fighting than live with the knowledge that he had abandoned innocents to their fate. It was exactly the kind of noble stupidity that made him both irreplaceable and impossible to control. The obsidian knife felt solid and reassuring in Thrain's grip, a connection to the woman who had tried to help him find a better way than endless cycles of violence and retribution. But Gunnar's deception had proven that such idealism was a luxury he could not afford. The traditional ways, strength, brutality, the willingness to strike first and ask questions later, remained the only reliable tools for protecting his people. Mercy was a weakness that enemies would exploit without hesitation. A runner arrived, breathless from his dash across the contested ground between the two forces. "My lord," he gasped. "Message from the stronghold. Your lady wife requests permission to join the battle with reinforcements." Thrain felt the obsidian knife grow cold in his palm. Linnéa was safe behind the walls of his stronghold, protected by capable defenders and far from the reach of Gunnar's ambitions. The last thing he wanted was to see her exposed to the dangers that had already claimed so many of his warriors. But the mention of reinforcements sparked a flicker of curiosity, despite his exhaustion and frustration. "What reinforcements?" he demanded. "I left barely enough men to defend the walls." "Riders, my lord, scattered members of the Raven clan responding to her letters. They've been arriving throughout the day, and she says there are enough now to make a difference if they can reach the battlefield in time." The irony was almost too bitter to contemplate. The strategy that had led them into this disaster might also provide the means for their salvation, but only if Thrain was willing to risk the life of the woman whose wisdom had both created and potentially solved their current predicament. The obsidian knife seemed to whisper of the generations of wise women who had wielded it, reminding him that true strength sometimes required accepting help from unexpected sources. "How many riders?" Tormund asked. 47, according to the count, the runner replied. "Not enough to turn the tide alone, but if they could coordinate with whatever Lord Magnus is doing at the ships—" "No," Thrain interrupted. "I won't risk my wife in this madness. Send word that she's to remain safely behind the walls, regardless of how the battle develops." But even as he spoke the words, Thrain knew they were born of emotion rather than strategy. 47 additional warriors, fighting with the desperation of men seeking to redeem their clan's honor, could indeed make a significant difference if deployed correctly. And Linnéa had already proven her tactical insight by conceiving the original rescue plan. The fact that Gunnar had anticipated and countered it spoke to his skill, not to any fundamental flaw in her reasoning. The obsidian knife caught the reflection of the burning ships in the distance, its surface seeming to dance with flames that spoke of destruction and renewal in equal measure. Magnus was still fighting down there, still causing problems for an enemy who should have been celebrating easy victory. His defiance was buying time, creating opportunities that a more conventional assault could never have achieved. "Send a different message," Thrain decided, his voice heavy with the weight of command and the knowledge that he was about to risk everything on a final gamble. "Tell my wife that she may bring her reinforcements, but only if she follows my tactical instructions to the letter. This battle has already cost us too much to lose through another failure of coordination." The obsidian knife felt warm again in his grip, a reminder that wisdom often came from unlikely sources and that the greatest victories were achieved not through strength alone, but through the willingness to trust in the insights of others. Gunnar had proven himself a masterful strategist, but he had also revealed the limitations of his own thinking. The Sea Wolf leader had anticipated a rescue attempt and prepared for its failure, but he had not considered the possibility that defeat might become the foundation for an entirely different kind of victory. As the runner departed with his message, and the flames continued to spread along the distant waterline, Thrain found himself thinking not of the battle ahead, but of the woman who had given him this ancient weapon. Linnéa had trusted him with her clan's most precious artifact, a blade that had guided wise women through centuries of difficult decisions. Now it would guide him through what might be the most important choice of his leadership, whether to retreat and preserve what remained of his forces, or to gamble everything on one final attempt to snatch victory from the jaws of carefully orchestrated defeat. The leather war banner cracked in the evening wind as Linnéa led 47 warriors. Down the mountain path toward Raven's Gorge, its raven emblem stark against the darkening sky. The banner had flown over her father's greatest victories, had been carried into battle by 3 generations of Eriksson leaders, and now it flew again, under circumstances none of them could have imagined. The daughter of the defeated clan was riding to save the man who had killed her father, leading scattered warriors in a desperate attempt to preserve the peace their marriage had been meant to secure. Behind her rode men she had not seen in years, oath brothers of her father who had scattered to distant shores after his defeat, younger sons who had sought service with foreign jarls, grizzled veterans who had thought their fighting days were behind them. They had answered her letters not out of loyalty to Thrain Wolfborn, but out of love for the girl who had grown up among them, the last daughter of a bloodline they had served with honor. Their faces bore the weathered marks of hard years and harder choices, but their eyes burned with the fierce determination of men seeking redemption. "The ships are burning," called Ragnar One-Eye, her father's former captain who had ridden farthest, to answer her summons. "Whatever Magnus is doing down there, he's making Gunnar pay for his cleverness." Linnéa could see the flames reflecting off the water, could hear the distant sounds of combat echoing off the canyon walls. The burning longships meant that Magnus had survived the trap that had claimed so many others, but it also meant that the real captives, the women and children whose freedom justified all this bloodshed, were in immediate danger. Fire was an indiscriminate killer, as likely to consume the innocent as the guilty. The leather war banner snapped again in the wind, its raven design seeming to spread its wings in preparation for flight. Linnéa had chosen to carry it herself rather than entrust it to one of the warriors, understanding that its symbolic power was as important as the swords and axes her followers wielded. She was not just bringing reinforcements to her husband's aid. She was announcing that the Raven clan had chosen its side in this conflict. "Remember the plan," she called back to her riders. "We hit their rear positions while they're focused on the ships and Thrain's main force. Drive through their lines and create chaos, but don't get drawn into extended combat. Our goal is disruption, not destruction." It was a strategy born from necessity and desperation, the only option available to a small force facing superior numbers in prepared positions. They could not hope to defeat Gunnar's warriors in conventional battle, but they might succeed in sowing enough confusion to give Magnus the time he needed to complete his mission at the longships. Everything depended on timing and the enemy's inability to respond quickly to threats from multiple directions. The leather banner felt heavy in her grip, weighted down by the memories of all the battles it had witnessed. Her father had carried it at the siege of Thorhaven, where he had earned his reputation as a tactician of uncommon skill. Her grandfather had borne it during the great raid on the Saxon shore, when the Raven clan had brought home enough silver to fund a generation of prosperity. Now she carried it into battle against the very warrior who had ended her father's career, fighting to preserve a marriage that had been born from defeat and humiliation. The irony was not lost on her. Less than a week ago, she had been a captive in Thrain's hall, terrified of the brutal warrior who had claimed her as a prize of war. Now she was risking her life to save him, leading men who had once sworn to see him dead in a desperate attempt to preserve the peace their union represented. The transformation felt surreal, like stepping from one life into another without warning or preparation. "Contact ahead," Ragnar warned, pointing toward the ridge where Gunnar's sentries maintained their watch. Two warriors, looking toward the burning ships. "They haven't seen us yet." The leather war banner seemed to pull forward in her grip, eager to announce the Raven clan's presence to their enemies. But surprise was their greatest advantage, the only thing that might allow them to achieve their objectives before Gunnar could reorganize his defenses to meet this new threat. Once they committed to battle, there would be no retreat, no second chances for cleverness or subtlety. "Bjorn, Eric, take them quietly," Linnéa ordered, her voice carrying the authority that came from bloodline and desperate necessity. "Everyone else, prepare for the charge. When those sentries fall, we go hard and fast, straight through their center." The warriors who had answered her call spread out in attack formation, their horses snorting and stamping with the nervous energy that preceded combat. These were not the disciplined troops that Thrain commanded, but rather a collection of individualists bound together by shared history and common purpose. They would fight with the ferocity of men seeking to reclaim their honor, but they would not have the cohesion that made conventional tactics possible. The leather banner caught the last light of day as Linnéa watched Bjorn and Eric slip forward, toward the unsuspecting sentries. In the distance, she could see the main battle unfolding like a deadly dance, with Thrain's forces pinned down by Gunnar's superior position, while Magnus's desperate assault on the longships created a second front that threatened to overwhelm the enemy's carefully laid plans. Everything balanced on a knife's edge, and her small contribution might tip the scales in either direction. The sentries fell without raising an alarm, their bodies disappearing into the shadows as Bjorn and Eric returned to the main force. 47. Riders now faced the moment of truth, the instant when careful planning would give way to the chaos of battle. Linnéa raised the leather war banner high above her head, its raven emblem catching the wind like a bird preparing to take flight. "For the honor of the Raven clan," she cried, spurring her horse forward down the slope toward Gunnar's unprepared rear guard. "For the innocents who trust in our protection, for the peace that our blood has purchased." The charge began in thunder and ended in steel, 47 riders crashing into the enemy's flank with the fury of a storm breaking against the shore. The leather war banner streamed behind Linnéa as she led the attack, its ancient fabric finally flying again in battle as it had been meant to do. Around her, the scattered sons of her father's clan fought with the desperation of men who had been given one last chance to prove their worth, one final opportunity to transform defeat into something approaching victory. Behind them, the ships continued to burn, while ahead of them, Gunnar's carefully orchestrated battle plan began to unravel under the pressure of too many simultaneous crises. The leather banner had returned to war, and with it came the promise that some things, honor, loyalty, the protection of the innocent, were worth any sacrifice. The amber prayer stone glowed like captured sunlight in Magnus's bloodied palm as he stood on the deck of Gunnar's flagship, surrounded by the bodies of warriors who had died defending their lord's ambitions. The stone had been blessed by the wise women of his clan, worn smooth by generations of fighters who had carried it into battle as protection against the kind of death that left no mark on the world. Now, as flames consumed the other longships around him and the sound of Linnéa's charge echoed from the distant shore, Magnus understood that some victories could only be won through sacrifice. The real captives huddled behind him, 60 women and children from the outlying settlements, their faces pale with terror but alive, miraculously alive. The rescue had cost 17 of his 20 warriors, good men who had followed him into this floating hell because they trusted in his judgment and Thrain's leadership. Their blood stained the deck planks beneath his feet, a crimson testament to the price of mercy in a world that understood only strength. Gunnar the Red lay dying against the ship's mast, his red-painted armor cracked and his breathing labored from the wound Magnus had given him in their final duel. The Sea Wolf leader had fought with the skill and fury of a man who understood that defeat meant not just death, but the complete destruction of everything he had built. His coalition of warriors from different clans had already begun to fracture. As the burning ships and Linnéa's unexpected assault created chaos they had not prepared for. "You think you've won something here?" Gunnar wheezed, blood flecking his lips as he spoke. "But this changes nothing. Other Jarls will see what happened to me and learn from my mistakes. Your soft ways will still be seen as weakness." The amber prayer stone felt warm against Magnus's palm, heated by the fires that surrounded them and the desperate fighting that had brought them to this moment. He looked down at the man who had orchestrated this elaborate trap, who had turned their mercy into a weapon against them, and felt not hatred, but a profound sadness for the waste of it all. "Perhaps," Magnus replied, kneeling beside his dying enemy, "but they'll also see that attacking the Wolf Clan's people carries a price they might not be willing to pay. And they'll remember that Thrain Wolfborn's warriors never abandoned their own, no matter the odds." Around them, the other longships continued to burn, their crews either dead or swimming desperately for shore. Magnus's surviving warriors, Sven, Bjorn, and Eric, worked to cut the flagship free from its moorings while maintaining watch for any remaining enemies. The real captives had been bound in the ship's hold, hidden beneath decks, where a casual observer would never think to look. Gunnar's deception had been complete, but it had also concentrated his most valuable assets in a single location. The amber prayer stone caught the reflection of flames as Magnus stood and moved toward the ship's steering oar. The wind was favorable, and the tide was beginning to turn. If they could get the longship moving, they might be able to bring the captives safely to shore before Gunnar's remaining allies regrouped and attempted a counterattack. But the navigation would be treacherous in the darkness, and they would be vulnerable to archery from the shore. A horn sounded from the direction of the main battle, not the deep voice of Thrain's war horn, but the higher, clearer call of a Raven clan signal. Linnéa's assault was succeeding, driving through Gunnar's rear positions and creating the kind of confusion that turned organized defense into panicked retreat. The coordination was imperfect, There had been no time for detailed planning, but the multiple threats were overwhelming an enemy who had prepared for a single, predictable assault. "The stone grows warm when the tide of battle turns," Sven observed, seeing the amber glow in Magnus's palm. "My grandmother always said it could sense when fortune was about to shift." Magnus nodded, though he kept his attention focused on the tactical situation developing around them. Gunnar's forces were breaking apart under pressure from 3 directions: Thrain's frontal assault, Linnéa's flanking attack, and the destruction of their naval assets. The Sea Wolf coalition had been held together by the promise of easy victory and rich plunder. With both prospects disappearing in smoke and blood, their loyalty to Gunnar's cause was evaporating as quickly as the flames consumed his ships. The amber prayer stone seemed to pulse with its own inner light as Magnus made the final adjustments to their course. The rescued captives were safe now, or as safe as anyone could be, in the middle of a battle that was rapidly spinning out of control. The original strategy had failed, but from that failure had emerged something more valuable: proof that the Wolf Clan's commitment to protecting the innocent was absolute, regardless of the personal cost. "Look there," Eric called, pointing toward the shore where torches were beginning to appear in organized formations. "Thrain's advancing. The enemy. Lines are collapsing." The sight of his Jarl's forces finally moving forward after hours of defensive fighting sent a surge of relief through Magnus's chest. The gamble had worked. Gunnar's elaborate trap had been turned against itself through a combination of desperate courage and the kind of tactical flexibility that came from trusting in unexpected allies. Linnea's arrival with the scattered Raven clan warriors had provided the final element needed to transform potential disaster into hard-won victory. As the longship moved steadily toward shore, carried by wind and tide toward the safety of friendly forces, Magnus allowed himself a moment to reflect on the lessons learned in blood and fire. Mercy was not weakness when backed by the willingness to fight for what you believed in. Trust, placed in the right people, could overcome even the most careful enemy planning. And sometimes the greatest victories came not from perfect execution of brilliant strategies, but from the courage to adapt when everything went wrong. The amber prayer stone grew cooler in his palm as the immediate danger passed, its glow fading to the warm radiance of captured sunlight. Behind them, the burning hulks of Gunnar's fleet continued to light up the night sky, a beacon that would be visible for miles and serve as a warning to any other Jarls contemplating similar adventures. The Wolf Clan had paid a heavy price for this victory, but they had also sent a message that would resonate throughout the northern territories. The rescued captives began to sing, a traditional song of thanksgiving that their grandmothers had taught them, voices joining together in harmony that spoke of survival and hope renewed. Magnus smiled despite his exhaustion, understanding that this was what they had really been fighting for all along. Not territory or treasure or reputation, but the simple right of innocent people to live their lives without fear. The silver wedding cup caught the dawn light as Thrain and Linnéa stood together on the walls of their stronghold, watching the funeral pyres burn in the valley below. The cup had been reforged from the original ivory vessel, hammered out and shaped anew by the clan's master smith, its silver surface etched with runes that told the story of their battle at Raven's Gorge. It was no longer the symbol of tentative hope it had been on their wedding night, but something harder and more precious, a testament to love tested by fire and proven strong enough to endure. 3 days had passed since the battle that had shattered Gunnar's coalition and sent his surviving allies fleeing to distant shores. The cost had been heavy. 17 warriors lost with Magnus's flanking force, 12 more fallen in the main assault, and countless wounded who would carry the scars of that day for the rest of their lives. But the captives had been freed, the threat to their territory eliminated, and something more valuable than victory had been forged in the crucible of shared struggle. "Magnus says the northern Jarls are already sending envoys," Linnéa reported, her hand resting on her husband's arm as they watched the smoke rise toward the mountains. They want to understand how the Wolf clan managed to turn defeat into victory. Our strategy that failed so completely could still achieve its objectives. Thrain nodded, though his thoughts were focused less on political implications than on the woman beside him. She had returned from battle with her father's war banner, torn by enemy arrows, and her armor stained with blood that was not her own. The terrified girl he had married a week ago had been transformed into something magnificent, a partner who could stand beside him in the darkest moments and find ways to create light. The silver wedding cup reflected their faces as Thrain raised it between them, the metal warm from the morning sun and the heat of their joined hands. "To those who didn't return," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command and the pain of loss. "And to those who showed us that some things are worth any sacrifice. To the future we're building together," Linnéa added, her voice steady despite the tears that touched her eyes, "and to the trust that makes such a future possible." They drank from the cup in turn, tasting wine that had been blessed by both their clan's wise women, a blend of traditions that spoke to the unity they had forged through trial and bloodshed. The liquid was sweet with honey and bitter with herbs, complex flavors that reflected the complicated nature of the peace they had won. Below them, Magnus approached the funeral pyres with the amber prayer stone glowing softly in his hand. The rescued captives stood beside him, adding their voices to the songs that would carry the spirits of the fallen to whatever realm awaited them beyond death. It was a scene of profound beauty and profound sadness, the kind of moment that defined what it meant to lead people who were willing to die for something greater than themselves. "Your brother has asked permission to settle his followers on the eastern borders," Thrain said, watching as Olaf Eriksson supervised the construction of new defensive positions. "He says the scattered Raven clan members want to rebuild, but under our protection rather than as rivals." "And what did you tell him? That it's your decision as much as mine," Thrain replied, understanding that their marriage had become something more than political alliance. "This is our clan now, shaped by both our traditions. The choices we make should reflect both our wisdom." The silver wedding cup caught the light again as Linnéa turned it in her hands, studying the etched scenes that chronicled their unlikely love story. The battle at Raven's Gorge was there, rendered in flowing lines that captured both the chaos of combat and the moment when their separate forces had united to achieve the impossible. But so too were quieter scenes, their first tentative conversations, the moment she had offered her strategic insight, the instant when trust had replaced fear in their relationship. "Then I say yes," she decided. "Let them stay. Let the Raven clan find new life as part of something larger. It's what my father would have wanted, even if he was too proud to see it while he lived." The sound of hammers rang across the courtyard as construction began on new quarters for the warriors who had answered Linnéa's call and chosen to remain. The stronghold was expanding, growing to accommodate the changes that victory had brought. Soon there would be children playing in courtyards where enemy blood had once been spilled, scholars learning tactics that blended Wolf Clan strength with Raven Clan subtlety. "Magnus wants to name the new settlement Peace Forge," Thrain said, with a smile. "He claims it's where we learn to hammer swords into something more useful. And what do you think?" "I think he's been spending too much time with the wise women," Thrain replied, "but I also think he's right. What we built at Raven's Gorge wasn't just military victory, it was proof that different approaches to leadership could work together, rather than against each other." The silver wedding cup reflected the sun's growing strength as morning gave way to day, its surface bright with promise and warm with the heat of new beginnings. In the distance, riders approached under banners of truce, envoys from distant clans who wanted to understand how the Wolf clan had transformed potential disaster into lasting advantage. The story of their battle would spread throughout the northern territories, becoming legend that would shape how future generations thought about strength and mercy, tradition and innovation. "What happens now?" Linnéa asked, her voice carrying both curiosity and confidence. "When the envoys arrive and the terms are negotiated, what kind of future are we building?" Thrain considered the question as he watched the funeral pyres burn down to glowing embers. The men who had died at Raven's Gorge had purchased something precious with their sacrifice, not just the freedom of 60 captives, but proof that their way of life could evolve without losing its essential strength. The silver wedding cup, in his hands, represented that evolution, a symbol reforged from broken pieces into something more beautiful than the original. "A future where our children won't have to choose between honor and wisdom," he said finally, "where strength serves mercy rather than replacing it, where the best parts of our different traditions can grow together into something neither clan could have achieved alone." The silver wedding cup caught the morning light one final time as they prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, its reforged surface reflecting not just their faces, but the faces of all those who had contributed to this moment. Magnus, with his unshakable loyalty; Olaf, with his hard-won wisdom; the scattered Raven clan warriors who had answered love's call rather than hatred's summons. Together, they had proven that even the strongest walls could be rebuilt into something more welcoming, that even the deepest wounds could heal if treated with patience and care. The future stretched before them like an unwritten saga, full of possibility and promise, ready to be shaped by the choices they would make together.